So there's a lot of talk about how do I work with my chart. We've all heard it, we've all read it, we've all seen people talk about it. How do I work with my chart? I want to work with my chart, and how do I, make things better or make my life more perfect or whatever? But ultimately, that's usually the pretext for, right? For how do I work with my chart? But I'm going to propose a way to kind of work with your chart. And I'm going to propose it in two different ways, and I'm going to explore it in a bunch of different formats. So today we're going to look at love and marriage. We're going to look at love and marriage. And my proposal is that one of the best ways to work with your chart is to work with your chart as, or to look at your chart as this living, moving thing that works, that moves within time, or as this organism that moves within time. And as time moves, as the cycles of time move, so do we also move into the different cycles with it. So, similarly to how we would think about numerology. So, for instance, let's say I'm in a 3 year. That means if I add the number three to January, which is, of course, the first month, that means that I would be in a 4 month. That means that the next month I would be in a five, and then the next month after that I'd be in a six, et cetera, right? So the numerologist will have different significations for all of those different months, right? For all of those different numbers that each month falls under. And we can do similarly so that ultimately we can, and so then you can work with the energy of your numbers each month, right? Well, we can do the same thing similarly with the planets. And so I'm going to propose, as I say, like a technique for looking through it. It's basically a way that you can do with your own chart. And what we're going to do, as I mentioned, we're going to do it with love. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to perfect both the natural significator for whatever it is that we're working on and the house ruler, or the house of the, rather, the house cusp. So those are the two things that we will be specifically looking at. And of course, the house cusp becomes the ascendant of that matter, right? So, and then the planet becomes kind of a universal significator for that matter. So, for instance, when I say something like a natural significator, I'm talking about the sun signifying fame, Jupiter signifying wealth or substance, Venus signifying love or marriage, Mars signifying courage what would be, yeah, or something like courage, the moon signifying women, Saturn signifying stones and boulders, boulders and things like that, or Saturn signifying depression, right? Mars signifying anger, right? So if we're talking about things that we can work on, I need to work on my anger issues. We can go directly to Mars, who's the natural significator for anger. Now, is there a house necessary placement? Not necessarily with that. So we'll get to see all of as we come to explore this, we'll get to see when, yes, we'll look at a house cusp and we'll look at a significator, a natural significator, what the difference in my estimation that is, and then also when it's not necessary. So, for instance, when I'm dealing with my anger issues, I don't need to find a house, I need to work with Mars. So, the actual technique is that we go granular with profections in order to know what planetary influences we will be working with on a monthly uh whatever on a monthly basis. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to do a little bit of predictive astrology, or backwards predictive astrology based on perfection, which we kind of have done before, and we've used Leontyne Price as well. We did it with Leontyne Price's Metropolitan Opera debut on January 27th, 1961. But what we're going to look at today is the day of her marriage. So we're going to go to the day of her marriage so that we can see how the perfections kind of work out. And then we'll kind of look at my proposal and how I propose to kind of work with this living astrology kind of thing. So first of all, Leontine Price got married on the 31st of August, 1952. Okay, so she was 25 years old. She just turned, well, she turned 25 February 10th of 1952. So that means that as far as her regular ascendant, right, this would represent 0, 12, 24, 36. So this is 24. Am I in the whole sun? Hans whole sun, yes. This would take us to 25, right? So that's as her ascendant. So like her general life path. And even that, if we look at that, for the year, Jupiter is the ruler of the year with the exalted Venus, who is the lady of the natural significator of marriage. Right. So the ruler of the year is already with the lady of marriage. So that already gives us quite something that we could look at. But we could also look at it from a different perspective. We could look at it from the seventh house, right? Because that's the house of marriage, right? So already we know that when we look at the life, right? First house is the house of life. When we look at the house of life, it brings us to the second house, which naturally means money, but it also brings us to an exalted Venus, and which is who signifies love and marriage. But we also can come to the seventh house and we can perfect that, right? So it's not just the ascendant that perfects, the entire chart perfects. So we can do the same thing and we can find out who is the ruler of marriage for the seventh house. I mean, for the year. So the ruler of marriage at 24 from February 10, what of 60 of what 51 until 52 is the sun. But when we come to 1952 to February of 1952, the ruler of marriage for the year is Mercury, who is also with the ruler of the year and with Venus. So now the plot has thickened, right? The plot is already, no, we're doing predictive astrology. I haven't even started talking about how to work with your chart, but now it's looking even more predictive, right? We've got the ruler of the year is with Venus, and now also the ruler of the seventh is with Venus. No, note that the ruler of the year, the ruler of the seventh, and Venus are all together, and Venus and Jupiter are highly strong, but the ruler of the seventh of the year, the ruler of marriage for the year, is not particularly strong. So we're going to keep that in mind because you all don't know this, but of course I do. This marriage didn't really last. And so one of the things I want to kind of look at is some of the discrepancies that we're going to come to. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. Anyway, so we've established that the ruler of the year for 1952, the year that she gets married, is Mercury, who is with the ruler of the year, right, ruler of the seventh of the year, who's with the ruler of the year and with Venus, as I've mentioned before. Now let's take it to the month of the wedding. So the ruler of the seventh, this is February, this is what, March, this is April, this is May, this is June, this is July, bam, this is August. So if we remember, not only now is this the month of the wedding, this is the month of the wedding, but it's also the year. Remember, this is where we perfected to for the year. So now the ruler of the year is also the ruler of the month. And the ruler of the month and the ruler of the year is with Mercury and with the ruler of the seventh of the year and Venus, the ruler of marriage herself. That looks pretty honky-dory and fabulous, doesn't it? Very cool. However, now let's see if we can get to the day. So it's going granular with Profections that I think is where it gets interesting. But we don't have to go this granular to do the working on ourself thing. But for the predictive, it does get interesting. So now we can go to the actual date. This is the 10th of August. Every house is 2.5 days. So every two houses is 5 days. So this takes us to the 15th, 20th, 25, 30, 30, 31. So 31 is going to take us pretty much into the middle of Scorpio. And so now here is where we start to, once again, we start to kind of get into what we're looking at. Now it brings us to on the actual day, it brings us to a Sun Mars square. That's interesting, right? The month was all lovey-dovey and sweet and beautiful, but or or all fantasy and ecstasy and bliss, right? But this Sun Mars thing is a little bit more, shall we say, competitive. And indeed, both of these people were well-known singers. They had Matter of fact, they were married as they were about to do this huge international tour of Porgy and Bess, and he was singing Bess. He was singing Porgy, or maybe he should have been. He was singing Porgy, and she was singing Bess. And so they did this whole touring thing, and then their careers took on all of this different, took on a different kind of trajectory. And within 6 years, they were divorced. Okay, within 6 years they were divorced, and by 1972, well, 60 years they were separated. Sorry, and by 1972 they were divorced, and they spent very little time together while they were married because their careers kind of took over. So we can kind of see, and they were quite competitive with each other. We can kind of see that already. So what's looking like it should have been a blissful experience, underneath it is really kind of this Mars square. Now, as I mentioned, we can perfect the seventh, and we can perfect also, but we can also perfect the natural significator. So when we're perfecting a cusp, we're essentially perfecting an ascendant of the issue, which basically kind of represents the person in the issue, right? So it's kind of what happens to the person through the issue. However, when we're looking at the actual planet that is the natural significator, that's where I think the quote working with stuff can happen. And especially if we don't go granular today, although we can certainly. Because Venus, as the natural significator of love, is going to be in a different place all the time. She's going to be in a different place every month. She'll be going retrograde sometime. That's going to one affect it, right? Where she is by transit is going to affect any love related issues. Let's say that's what we want to work on this year, finding a relationship or clearing up our relationship karma, right? And so we know that she's going to be in a different sign, for most of the, she's going to be moving along. And so we can often, like when she's in Taurus, that's a good time to do work. When she's in Libra, that's a good time to do work. And when she's in Pisces, that's a good time to do work, right? So we know all those things. But at the same time, there's always time to be doing work, but it can be of all types. So what I'm proposing is, so let's say in the year 1952, we instead of perfecting a cusp, we perfect Venus as the lady of love and marriage, right? And which then would give us an idea of what kinds of issues we should be working on monthly, right? We'll find the ruler of the year, right? And then we'll figure out what we should be doing monthly. So love for the year will be but one planet, and then love throughout the month will be reflected by whatever kind of system is reflect. I'll get to it. Never mind. So this is 0, 24, same thing as like any cusp, 0, 12, 24, 36. We're talking about 25. So that brings us here. So the first thing that we see is love for the year is this Sun Mars square. Excuse me. We also found that love for the year was what love for the day was also this Sun Mars square. Note also that the ruler of the seventh is the sun. Leo is the ruler of the seventh, who's in a square to Mars. So this is really kind of, shall we say, ground level shit that needs to be worked on in the person around love and marriage. Because if love and marriage has this kind of shall we say, of manifestation, that can be a threat to it, right? Because certainly Mars is contentions, the sun is arrogance. Sun and Mars are both the fire planets, and they're in a square, so this person can get hot-headed and angry, and and maybe even a little abusive. So those tendencies all of a sudden be something that need working on this year, right? Because Mars is the ruler of the year for love. So already we know that February, the year, and February are about this Mars Saturn square. And so we want to consciously work it. This is where the working it would be, right? So let's say Lanchine were aware, and then also obviously, like I said, seeing the implications too, right? The implications are also that, hey, the sun is the ruler of the seventh and in that square with Mars, which gives us what other implication, which is that there are going to be problems in marriage in this chart. But nobody likes to deal with the deterministic aspect. So now we're working with it. And so instead of saying, well, shit, things are fucked up, we're saying, in February of this year, especially, I have to work on the bullshit that I bring to my love life that is encapsulated within this square. And I have to work on it hard because I'm getting married in August, right? And And this is the local determination, right? That's a term that I use all the time. Local determination of the ruler of the seventh and marriage. Marriage is in peril. Marriage is something that is somewhat perilous. Note also that the ruler of the seventh is in detriment. So there's a coldness, right? She's in Saturn's cold and dry sign. Well, it's not a cold and dry sign, but the Saturn is cold and dry. She's in an air sign, which is more moist and wet, but she's in Saturn's sign and Saturn is cold. So this person may be cold, may be combative, may be competitive, and that don't work in love. Maybe me first, that don't work in love. That don't work in marriage and love, in partnership, right? So that year in 1952 in February around my birthday, I wanted to work with my shit. I'd say, you know what, that Sun Mars thing is of pressing importance that I need to do something with. Then in March, we would move to Taurus, and that's ruled by the Venuses with the Mercury and the Jupiter and the Mercury and the Jupiter, and also the Moon is applying to her by square. Now, Moon and Venus is women. So that would be maybe a time to get into my softest feminine, most feminine self, even though it's a square. Squares could maybe be translated into the action I have to take, right? Because squares usually are challenges that have to be resolved, right? So squares become this action. So maybe there's actions that I have to take to heighten my femininity, to be more receptive, to be more womanly, right? So, or whatever, right? So, once again, what I'm looking at really is the local determination of the ruler of the cusp for each month, and that then tells us what's happening for me with love this month, right? So we can, every month it's going to be different. Next month we're moving to Mercury. Mercury is the fallen planet with these other two. Why? Remember, he was also the ruler of the seventh of the year 1952. Why is he though? So what would that be about? What is it that he has to learn to communicate, right? Mercury has to learn to communicate is if he's in a mute sign of Pisces, which is his fall, right? So there are communication issues in this chart based on what we then look at as we take it into the next month. As we take what we moved to April, right? So that was February. This is March. This is April, right? So as we move to April, now the focus is on this mute Mercury who can't say what they need to, but instead will just rage and go crazy, right? So who might not be able to say exactly everything that they need to put into. So they've got to work on their shit. And the moon has already left it, but we see the moon is in Mercury's sign. So there's a challenge of a need to be able to figure out how to communicate. And within this area of love right now, That's what needs to happen for the month of March. So then we move to the now we move to the other part of the square. We move back to femininity and receptivity, but now it's about working with our emotions. And look, we've got the Pluto here, we've got the Rahu here. So now it's working with our emotions, working with ambition, working with our impulses that are less than conventional. And then also we're back with the moon Venus square, and of course these other two planets too as well. So it's probably something of a continuation between what we were just looking at with how we have to work on our communication, and also maybe it's we have to work on our thinking, right? The moon is our thoughts, the Mercury is how we put them into words. So do you see what I'm doing? I mean, I could just keep going. Here's we come back to now we come to the actual cusp of the seventh house, where the Sun Mars is the local determination of the sun, right? And so that's problematic. And what happens if we were to come to the Sun Mars during a month when maybe Mars actually by transit is here in Leo opposing? Actually, if anything, we've got a T square between Sun, Mars, and Neptune. That ain't any fucking good for a good marriage. So this person has to deal and all this stuff in Pisces. So this person doesn't really have a, shall we say, a realistic probably idea of love already. So these are all the ideas, the things that they would be having to work with in that area of love in their life. Like I haven't done any more of the predictive shit. I've just gone into how we could be working with whatever, and it basically totally based on the natal chart. Now, of course, as I just intimated, we can also layer on top of that. We can layer on top of that the transits that are happening that affect these systems, right? So, like I said, let's say that let's say that Mars was on that Neptune when we get to whatever month that was. What was it? February, March, April, May, June. So when we get here to June and we get to the Leo month, at which reflects the Sun Mars square, I mean the T square with the Neptune as well. Let's say that there's a Mars there by transit, which would intensify it. And so then we have to deal with our anger issues on top of it. So you see how I'm just kind of piling more of the significations on as we get to it. But if you're really interested in working with your chart, you can do this with everything. It will all be the same. You'll come back to the same systems over and over again, but you will also, like I said, if you start putting on top of it stuff with any kind of transits as well, and see and then also how the different aspects. I mean, in this chart there are a lot of squares, and so this person was super super busy life and super ambitious and super driven, but not everybody will have charts like that. And and not all squares, remember, not all squares are malefic. That's the important thing to be thinking of. Reception dispels evil, and so good receptions in almost any kind of aspect can dispel what could be malefic about them. And so, in a lot of these situations, things are at, well, for instance, look at that Jupiter applying to Saturn, Jupiter at 5 Pisces, Saturn at 6 Sagittarius. That's actually a very that's a really benefic square because Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius and he's applying to that planet. So, and then he's in his own sign as well. So that's really, so he's pushing his own power onto the Saturn, and then he's pushing power onto Saturn. And then Saturn is in his own sign, so he's receiving Saturn from it. So that's my point, is that when we take kind of into account when we get to that system, we haven't gotten to that system yet. We started the year in that system, Sun, Jupiter to Saturn, right? So we really were talking mostly about all of that stuff, but look at how the Saturn does square it, which shows that there's more challenges to the love interest. This person's really all work, all business, all work, all business. And maybe the love thing is not so easy for them, but you could bet that they're always complaining about it. right? And so if they wanted to work on it, they wanted to do something about it, then this kind of technique is what I'm proposing. And so next time that we look at it, we'll look at something as far as money is concerned. We'll maybe look at Trump or some other rich motherfucker, and then we could do the same thing with Jupiter. Or the ruler of the second. The ruler of the second would show more kind of the events that we could expect, and then the Jupiter would give us the work that we could do about it. And so, for instance, I just want to show you how you can kind of combine these. So we had already talked about how the ruler of how the perfected seventh house came to Scorpio for the day of her wedding, right? And thus came to this system, this T square, right? Which is not a really good sign for marriage. So there'd be a lot of work to do, right? Or rather, we would know that it's probably not going to be particularly stable. However, if we do the same thing with the Venus, we come to, okay, so where was it? So this is the year, right? So this is February, March, April, May, June, July, August. Look at how August is ruled by Libra and the part of fortune is there. So it looks so fabulous and beautiful, doesn't it? And so that's 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, a little bit, 30, 31, right? So wherever that moon is, and remember where the moon is where the moon is squaring Venus, and then of course Mercury is the ruler of the cusp, and the Mercury is here with it. So we can see that as far as the significator of love is concerned, we can see all the lovey dreamy stuff that was going on around the day. Ooh, this lurking Saturn. But when we do it by the seventh house, we can see the actual kind of structural instability that's karmically built in. So there's a karmic instability or challenge. There's a karmic challenge built into the marriage life. And there'd be a lot of work. There'd be a lot of work. So if you stay unconscious, you stay fully unconscious, then yeah, then the fate just kind of takes over and the chart just kind of goes into default mode and fucks you over in the marriage area. And of course, she never got married again. And she never had any children. Her whole life was pretty much her career. So next time we'll maybe do the same thing with Jupiter as the ruler of substance, right? Like I said, we could do the same thing if I've got anger issues with Mars, or if I'm a fucking coward, I'm bullied all the time with Mars, as the anger, dealing with my depression. Saturn and depression, right? We can do the same thing, looking at these same things. And so we'll look at a different chart for each of these issues and see how that comes out. Thanks.